I wonder if you know, are familiar with the California review of EMF risk, because that was an attempt to develop a different way of presenting, of interpreting this rather mixed collection of literature.
Yes, I'm very familiar with that. This was done probably 3 or 4 years ago at this point, led by Ray Neutra, who's in the State Department, I guess, of Environmental Protection or Health Department. This consisted included a number of public meetings to find out what people thought about possible hazards of power line fields, and it included a kind of Bayesian analysis where 3 employees of the State Department of the state gave their own views about how likely they thought various hazards were, and based upon reviewing other reviews as opposed to reviewing the scientific literature. So this was not a scientific review, but a kind of impressionistic review of other scientific reviews, coupled with public meetings, coupled with a kind of economic analysis. That was certainly a very clever approach and was novel. I think it's had virtually no impact any place in the risk circles. For one thing, the conclusions they drew about the likelihood of various kinds of hazards are very far from those that other health agencies have concluded. They concluded that, in their views, it was more likely than not that power line fields cause Alzheimer's disease and all sorts of other things. And the much more thorough reviews of the scientific literature by WHO find nothing of the sort. They say that maybe there's some suspicion that power line fields are associated with childhood leukemia, but that's the only endpoint for which they think there's any evidence, and even then, that's only a suspicion. To my knowledge, the California report has had no influence, even in California, in citing power lines or anything of the sort. And so it was a very interesting exercise, but I'm not sure that it's had too much of an effect.
Looks like there is a chapter about that California study in the Weidman book. I'm looking at it on the web here.
I like her.
That's right.
The study is very hard to compare with the more traditional scientific reviews, such as the WHO environmental health criteria documents. In these EHC documents, you've got a whole boatload of experts reviewing the literature and sending us out for all sorts of review. It's a scientific review, but the California report wasn't. It consisted of 3 experts from the state, all of whom had similar background, giving a kind of Bayesian judgment about how likely they thought it was that the fields cause various diseases. And so the study is not at all comparable to these more traditional assessments.
Actually, I would disagree when you say it's not a scientific review. I would say it's a different kind of scientific review. But as you say, by 3 individuals rather than some sort of representative community, but they did review the scientific literature. What I thought was interesting about it was that unlike most scientific reviews, the attempt was less to develop a consensus view than to develop a picture of what is the range of knowledge and the range of expectations about what was there. We actually had some influence on the beginning of it, though I argued against the prominence of their Bayesian numbers. I said they should not be stressing that because that's what everybody would quote, and that would be misleading. But some of the preliminary analysis where they were trying to figure out how the evidence could look from different perspectives, I thought represented a novel view and pointed in some ways to the limits of consensus approaches when you have really contradictory studies.
Well, it was a scientific review, but not a scientific review. They didn't review the original studies. They didn't point to one epidemiology study and say it was contradicted or supported by another. A scientific review of this literature, which is more than 1,000 papers now, will require more than 3 people with similar training. And the other problem was that it had a kind of Bayesian approach by giving views of how likely these people thought it was that there might be a health problem, but it didn't have the kind of logic that you need in a Bayesian analysis to look at evidence that would raise your confidence or decrease it. So it was a kind of impressionistic approach, which is probably the best that was possible given the very murky nature of the evidence. And so I agree with you. It was a very clever and innovative approach. I just think it was far enough afield from the traditional scientific reviews that it really hasn't had any impact at all. Although the activists who are very concerned about this problem seem to find this report and use it to justify their campaigns against power lines and what have you. As far as within the health protection community and health agencies, I think it just is out there in left field.
Any more questions?
Which is a shame because they spent a huge amount of time on this. I think Neutra spent several years on this project.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I had a question. You commented briefly on the challenges with doing risk communication on an international level. We've been talking mainly domestic, I think, in this room. And I was wondering if you could maybe go into more depth on some of those experiences with the WHO process and these individual nation or cultural differences in risk perception and how people form attitudes and what kind of attitudes result and how that affects risk communication of your particular area of EMF.
Yeah, I attend meetings in Europe about 6 times a year, roughly, many associated with the WHO, and the attitudes towards the health effects of these fields just vary tremendously. In the former Warsaw Pact nations, there seems to be even now a feeling among the health agencies and scientists and the public that these fields are very dangerous at low levels. And for Western scientists to go to a meeting in Armenia, which I did a couple of years ago, or Bulgaria, which I did a couple of years ago, and present views that are fairly well accepted in the West, and listen to scientists present their science and come to totally different conclusions, even among scientists, is a very strange thing. One expects scientists to generally disagree, but they're in the East, the former Warsaw Pact countries, their attitudes towards health and science are very different from those in the West. That's true also, I understand, with China, although I have less personal experience.
But yet, we're in a global society now, and as these products move across international, boundaries, we're going to have to communicate many times on an international level. So I suspect that that's going to be a challenge for all of us to deal with, is to respect those cultural differences in the engagement and communication processes.
Right. I mean, WHO has the series of fact sheets about power line fields or cell phones and cancer, which tries to present as fairly as possible the conclusions that scientists reach in developing these environmental health criteria documents. Whether people will accept these or not, depends, I guess, on their own cultural backgrounds. But I think all WHO can say is that this is as fair a discussion as we can say of what we know now and what we agree upon. The problem, I think, is that, for instance, if you go to Russia, their attitudes about medicine are very different. They still have the feeling that